The Idris Shah Foundation Podcast. Practical Psychology for Today. Welcome to the Idris Shah Foundation Podcast. On November the 11th, Saira Shah hosted our Risk webinar. In advance of this insightful event on how our human senses assess complex, modern risks, Saira spoke to a man described as probably the greatest living statistical communicator. Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter is chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge University. Crucially, he is also currently the joint chair of the Royal Statistical Society COVID-19 task force. Here he explains the mathematical and real-world underpinnings that inform his work on the pandemic and other statistical risks. He also illustrates why we need to use both our instinctive gut reactions in tandem with slow, methodical thinking to make sense of modern risks. "I think humans are a wonderful combination between the two," said Sir David. "People have said that you've got risks as analysis and you've got risk as feeling, and they're both terribly important. This interaction between the two, that's where I work quite a lot, is so riveting, particularly at this time of COVID."
Professor Sir David Spiegelhalter has been called probably the greatest living statistical communicator. He's devoted much of his career to helping the public understand risk. He's chair of the Winton Centre for Risk and Evidence Communication at Cambridge University. His rare gift for explaining how to use data to understand the probabilities of various risks is evidenced by his brilliantly readable book, The Art of Statistics. So David, we're so lucky to have you with us today, and I know that you're currently joint chair of the Royal Statistical Society COVID-19 task force, and you're very, very in demand. So thank you doubly for your kindness in joining us today. Can I ask you, we've seen a lot of psychological research that shows we tend to make judgments about risk based on emotions rather than facts. Why do we need statistics?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm a statistician, so I started off as a mathematician, but most of my work now is collaborations with psychologists. And I find there's such an exciting, way to work. And essentially, it's not a choice between an emotional gut reaction to risk and a mathematical probabilistic approach to risk. We all know about Danny Kahneman's distinction between thinking fast and slow, whether you call it type 1, type 2 thinking, whatever you want to call it. There are these two broad ways of approaching a problem. One which is very much to go with your first feelings, your gut reactions, and the other is to try to slow down and think through things methodically. Neither is right, neither is enough. I think humans are a wonderful combination between the two. It's so exciting to have those two perspectives to take on a problem. And risk. People have said, you've got risk as analysis and you've got risk as feeling, and they're both terribly important. And this interaction between those, I think, that where I kind of work quite a lot. And which is so riveting, particularly at this time of COVID, but actually in all our circumstances, in everything we do every day. Yeah.
And can you give me some examples of the common mistakes that public and journalists tend to make when faced with figures about risk, statistics about risk?
Well, first of all, I don't like to say that people make mistakes. I'm never going to say someone makes mistakes about their feelings, because people have fears and anxieties. I've got mine. I suffer from every bizarre sort of personal bias or whatever. I've got it. We've all got it. So it's not like I'm saying people are wrong in terms of their feelings. There are some things people are just wrong at when they do try to reason, when they think they're being reasonable about numbers or whatever, and yet they get hopelessly wrong. And the two famous ones that people have identified, people like Gert Gigerenzer have identified. The first one is really about, I think, relative risks and absolute risks. That media, we always hear stories about something doubling the risk, and that sounds frightening. Well, is it or not? We just don't know. Double, I always say, very little is still very little. I mean, the point is that we have to know double what. And once we say, if that thing is doubling is actually extremely rare, a 1 in a million chance of this happening in your lifetime or over a year, who cares? I mean, whoa, so what? It's just not important.
You had a great example of that in your book about bacon sandwiches.
Oh, the bacon sandwich is a standard one. A daily bacon sandwich increasing your risk of bowel cancer by 20%. And let's presume that's true. Well, it increases it from what? Well, about 6 percentage points over your lifetime. And so a 20% increase over that takes it up to about 7 percentage points. So that means that 100 people are going to have to eat a bacon sandwich every day of their lives to get 1 extra case of bowel cancer. And at that point, you kind of puts it in perspective.
I'm going back on the bacon now.
Oh yeah. So pass the brown sauce is the natural thing. But I like bacon. But and I must say, from my purely emotional response, when I looked at that data, I did cut down on the amount of bacon I ate. I wasn't going to eat it every day, but I still will eat it. It's not like it's now a forbidden thing. It's just one of those cream cake treats, I suppose. So, and the other one, of course, is in diagnostic testing. And we're seeing that a lot in COVID, the idea of false positives and so on. And those ideas, they can be deeply unintuitive, such as the recent claim that most of the positive tests for COVID are false positives. And under certain, even though the test is quite accurate. Now that actually can be true under certain assumptions.
Can you talk me through that?
Okay, shall I take you through it?
Yes,
okay.
please.
I'll take you through it. So the claim is that most of the positive tests are false positives. And that's based on the claim which was made by the minister that the COVID test has a false positive rate of 1%. That means that out of 100 people who haven't got the virus, 1 will test positive. Okay, let's assume that's true for the moment. It isn't, but let's assume it's true. Now, let's say that you're in the situation that we were in the summer, where only 1 in 1,000 people had the virus, and you test 1,000 people on average. Okay, you'll probably get the one who's got it, but you've got 1,000 or 999 others who haven't got it, and if 1% of them are going to test positive as a mistake, that's 10 of those who will test positive. So you've got 11 positives, and only 1 of them is actually a true positive.
Got you. I get you.
That's the situation that could have occurred during the summer when the virus was very rare, if you were using this test. There's 2 things that are wrong with that. And so it is theoretically possible that happens. That's not the situation at the moment. First of all, the people getting tests have nearly all got some symptoms, and for people who've got symptoms, the proportion who've got the virus isn't 1 in 1,000, it's about 5% or something like that. So actually then that will increase hugely the number of true positives. But the other thing is that the test false positive rate is way below 1%. It's more like 0.05%, 1 in 2,000, not 1 in 100 for a PCR test. And so 2 reasons why at the moment most of the people who get a positive test have got the virus. Doesn't mean they're infectious, but they have got the virus. So I think that what that shows is that almost a little reasoning can also be a bad thing, because the mathematics of that false positive thing was correct. It's just the assumptions were completely wrong. Basically, anything to do with diagnostic testing is really tricky. My intuition, oh God, it's one of the worst ones for intuition. And this is where, you can't think fast. I have to get out a piece of paper and start writing out the numbers. My intuition is hopeless on this as much as anybody else's. So the probability is tricky. I mean, I've said it so many times probably, but people ask me, oh well, why do people find probability and statistics so unintuitive and difficult? I just say, I've worked nearly 50 years. I've been working in this area, and I finally concluded that it's because probability and statistics really are unintuitive and difficult.
And that stopped me out of the stream of what I was going to ask you, because I'm a daughter in part of Tunbridge Wells, among other places.
Oh.
And now I realise that Tunbridge Wells is famous for a certain figure who's a enormous name in probability. Can you tell me about that?
The famous the nonconformist clergyman Thomas Bayes, who lived. Apparently, he was an appalling clergyman. His sermons were outrageously dull, apparently, but he was 18th century. Died in 1761. Fellow of the Royal Society, and he wrote an absolutely impenetrable, appallingly written paper. Although it did have a very vivid thought experiment behind it. Which introduced this idea of using probability theory to learn from experience, that probabilities don't exist out there in the world. Basically, they're a way of dealing with our own personal uncertainty about facts, and then as we receive new information, then our probabilities are revised according to what is now called Bayes' theorem, after the nonconformist boring vicar from Tunbridge Wells. Who's a fantastic figure in history. He lapsed into obscurity because although his paper was published, no one took much notice of it, and Laplace discovered the same results, about 10, 15 years later, and wrote it absolutely beautifully with wonderful clarity, and so got the credit essentially until a little while ago.
Does that help us around your problem of intuition versus statistics?
Yes, it does. I mean, the way Bayesian statistics tells us the formally correct, mathematically correct way to learn from experience. And so it's a wonderful result. And I view it as an ideal. However, it is an unachievable ideal because it kind of assumes that your understanding is correct from the beginning. It assumes you have good knowledge about how the world works, and essentially that your model is correct. In other words, the structure in which you are putting your probabilities is appropriate. But of course, that's wrong.
Yeah. Do you have a really simple, just before we move on, a really simple kind of anecdote or example to explain that kind of thinking? Because it's difficult to.
Well, of course, what I've just talked about the COVID test is a perfect example that we cannot interpret a COVID test when it's positive without knowing who it's being tested on. In other words, how common was COVID in the population in the first place? So in other words, if I tell you my COVID test was positive, the chance that it really is, I really do have the virus, to assess that, you need extra information. You have to know, well, what was the chance I'd had the virus before I took the test? And then I get the positive test. And then using Bayes' theorem, that probability is updated to the new probability, which is my, what's actually called a posterior probability, because it's after the test result has come in, my new probability of having the test. So, for example, that example I gave before, a random person being tested, there was a 1 in 1,000 chance they had the virus, but actually after the positive test came in, it only gone up to about 1 in 10. The chance they had the virus.
He worked out how to take life into account in a mathematical
It was a mathematically correct way of updating our uncertainties on the basis of new knowledge. Wow. However, it sounds great, doesn't it? That's all we have to do. No, because it assumes we do have some understanding how the world works. Because if there are possibilities that we never even thought of, then we're messed up. We'll get more and more confident, but actually we're being completely deluded because our assumptions were wrong. So this is, again, that was what I wanted to introduce, the idea about the COVID thing. Being mathematically correct is not enough if our basic assumptions, our understanding of the world and how it works is just wrong. And that is something that within this COVID debate, obviously, clearly is crucially important.
And I wanted to ask as well, we're sort of coming into it. What are some of the real life costs of making, basic mistakes in probability? Maybe we can put our assumptions aside for a moment and assume we've got our assumptions right, but in actually making the statistical mistakes.
Yeah, well, I would say getting your assumptions wrong is making a statistical mistake.
Yeah.
And usually, as I said, with software and things like that, the actual calculations will be will be appropriate. I mean, people can make actual errors in the calculations, but they're generally correct. So it's all to do with the fact that our assumptions are wrong. A classic one was the financial collapse from 2008. And it's not wholly due to it, but a lot of that was due to the fact that people had these financial models and they believed them. Now, the models worked correctly. They said all the things they were supposed to do, and they'd worked in the past. It's just that the assumptions were basically stopped being, appropriate, and they were just saying crazy things that caused enormous financial damage because people were making decisions on the basis of inappropriate models. So again, I come back to again, there's a wonderful phrase which I'm sure most people know of. What a famous statistician George Box said: all models are wrong, but some are useful. And it's a rather cliched phrase. It's got its own Wikipedia page, but you just have to say it again and again and again that we are, everything we claim is on the basis of our understanding of the world, and if that understanding is wrong, which our claims are inappropriate, and any mathematical representation of the world is always wrong. Is never absolutely correct. But however, it can be useful. And we're seeing that all the time with these epidemic models, which, are all wrong. They're all gross simplifications. And people say they're like a map rather than the actual territory. But they can be useful if treated very, very, very cautiously.
And now I'm going to ask you kind of really tough philosophical question, which is, given we're in this world where we're being swamped with more and more data at every moment, how can we, and our assumptions are bound to be wrong, how can we navigate our way through this increasingly complex world?
Oh, it's very difficult because we're all playing different roles in this. You've got the actual analysts, I suppose a bit like me, and looking at the data, finding it very difficult to negotiate through which ones do you believe, which is the best quality evidence, do the numbers mean what they say, what is a COVID death anyway? Trying to put those numbers in context, is this number big or small? Because you can't judge about numbers without putting them in some sort of context. And then you've got the decision makers, the politicians, and people like that. They've got to try to interpret all this stuff and make sense of it, and that's a real challenge. And then you've got the public, which I feel very sorry for them, being bombarded with rival claims and analyses, and the newspapers full up with graphs and statistics and stuff like this. And all quite often using the same data and coming to very different conclusions. So it is a real challenge, and there's no simple answer to this at all. All I can do is say what I do, because I spend my time sort of critiquing evidence, which is very much to look at the source, at the trustworthiness of the source. Essentially, what are the motivations? I ask, even before looking at data, why am I hearing this? What are the motivations of the person telling me the story? Are they trying to convince me of what they think? Or are they genuinely trying to inform me and enable me to make a better decision? And that's the first thing I ask. What are the motivations of the person who is telling me, or my source of the information or evidence? And if I know that that's coming from a source that has already made up its mind and is trying to persuade people of something, then I'm going to really struggle to take much notice of what they're saying, of what this data is saying. I'll look at it, but I'll always be thinking, well, what am I not being told? What have they cherry picked? So, and that's actually really quite challenging to do that, to spot when someone's cherry picking, because you have to know, what am I not seeing? And it's one of the most difficult things of all. It's easy in a way to take or critique what you're being told. It's being able to critique what you're not being told is one of the most difficult challenges there is in this area.